Alrighty, we are going to get started with our next presenter. Intermittent fasting has become one of the popular dietary trends that's out there. So my friend Colin is going to talk about the effects of intermittent fasting versus calorie restriction.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming out last round here. So my name is Colin, also a UWGB intern, but I'm actually going to be, more in the Madison area. All right, yeah, so I'm talking today about intermittent fasting versus continuous energy restriction and comparing some of those cardiometabolic risk factors. Okay, so kind of just like an overview. So going over the background and the significance, methodologies I went through, reviews of the 3 research articles and evaluations of those, main takeaways, sort of other relevant literature just to kind of wrap up. And then if there's any time for questions. Okay, so what is intermittent fasting and why is it so popular? Okay, so intermittent fasting is a form of calorie restriction. It's used as an alternative to continuous energy restriction, which you think of as like normal dieting, right? Like moderate restriction every day, like over the course of a week. Like you might have 300 calories to 500 calories less every day. So for the intermittent fasting, you have your time restricted eating, which you might think of like the popular one is like 16 versus 8. So 8 hours a day you'll be eating, and a 16-hour window you will not be eating. And then you have the alternate day fasting, which is on one day you'll be fasting, having 500 calories or more, or you'll be cutting out 500 calories, and the next day you'll be having an excess amount. The 5-2 method, which is 5 days you'll be eating in excess, about 500 calories more on 5 days. And then on the 2 fasting days, you'll be having very few calories, like 500, around 500 or so. And usually those 2 days will be non-consecutive. And then the 24-hour method, which is every week for a 24-hour period, we'll be having 0 calories. And then the rest of the days, you'll be eating like ad libitum, so like as you please. Yeah, so there's different debates, opinions, and then obviously a lot of ongoing research. It's a fairly new topic, a fairly new topic in terms of how much research there is. If the intermittent fasting offers any significant benefits over the continuous energy restriction. And then these are like personal claims I've heard. Oh yes, it's better for weight loss. It's better for my cholesterol and lipid levels. It gives me more energy, or it's easier to maintain, or it's like preference saying like I like it more than the normal calorie restriction or like normal dieting. Okay, so I'm sort of interested in this topic is because almost on accident, not purposefully, I partake in, or used to partake a lot in intermittent fasting, like being an athlete. Lots of times I would have like a snack very late at night, probably later than I should have, but like up to like 12, 1 a.m. And then I would have tennis practice the next day, and I might have something to drink, but might have not anything to eat until 4 or 5 p.m. And so until like right before the practice, and so that was a form of intermittent fasting. And I just heard a lot of people talking about it, and so it's a topic that just interested me, so I wanted to look into it. And then so the main thing I'll look into is how does the intermittent fasting compare to the continuous energy restriction, and then those cardiometabolic risk factors. Okay, so kind of just how I went about it. So we just used different research methods, different terms, and then I wanted to look, of course, for recent literature. To different types of studies like pilot studies and then randomized control study as well. Okay, first one. So randomized pilot study comparing 0-calorie alternate day fasting to the normal caloric restriction and then adults with obesity. Okay, so this was 2016. So they wanted to look at or evaluate the safety and tolerability of the alternate day fasting, which is once again on one day they're having 500 calories or so every day, and then the next day they're having excess. Back and forth through the week. And so they wanted to compare changes in that weight, body composition, different lipids, insulin sensitivity index, comparing the intermittent fasting to the continuous energy restriction. They looked at pretty small sample size, only 26 adults, 1855, BMI over 30. They also looked at non-smoker and then non-significant weight change. And then exclusion criteria, there's quite a few. There's lots of different chronic diseases. They have diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, dyslipidemia. You can see the list there. But they also, at the bottom, they had women who were currently pregnant, planning pregnant or lactating, were also excluded. And then so they had the 2 different groups. So randomized, either they had the 0-calorie alternate day fasting, or the other group was the continuous energy restriction. So they were cutting out 400 calories a day. So that was 8 weeks. And then they followed up after 24 weeks. Okay, so major findings. So the alternate day fasting achieved about 376 kilocalorie greater energy deficit every day compared to the continuous energy restriction. And then there was no significant difference between the groups in weight, lipids, insulin, or body composition. And then you see total cholesterol, HDL, LDL, there were significant decreases in both. And then for triglycerides, there was a significant decrease for the alternate day fasting at the 8-week mark, but that after the 24 weeks, it kind of rebounded. So just kind of the things I just talked about there. So I see for cholesterol, you can see on the very right, the sort of the third column, it shows at 8 weeks, non-significant difference there between the continuous energy restriction, alternate day fasting. Same thing for the HDL levels, the LDL levels, and then you see at the triglycerides for the alternate day fasting, there was a significant drop after that 8-week mark. Okay, so looking over the strengths and limitations. So strengths, it was a randomized design. Metabolic measurements were obtained during a controlled inpatient setting, and then the measurement of the energy intake using analysis of all the return food. But yeah, lots of limitations. So it was more of a pilot study based around like assessing safety and tolerability, very small sample size, so lack of statistical significance between the groups. Strategization by sex only, small number of males. This is a big thing with all these studies is they don't really look at the physical activity, they don't analyze it, record it. So that's a big confounding factor that they're not, that they can't really control for. And so they can't look at how much that effect on weight loss or other factors. Okay, so like sort of interpretation, it's not intermittent fasting does have a positive effect on those metabolic markers and risk factors, but has a similar impact to that continuous energy restriction. And intermittent fasting did show simply higher estimated energy deficit from the weight maintenance over the 8 weeks compared with the continuous energy restriction, but the weight loss was only about 1.1 kilograms greater. So that was what the research hypothesizes. That was from so because they had less calories taken in every day, there were modifications made. They had like less physical activity or thermic effective food went down. So different things are happening too. So that loss wasn't as great. And so I gave it a minus or negative for the grade. Okay. The second study, the effect of intermittent compared with CER on glycemic control patients with type 2 diabetes. So this was a very long 24-month, 2-year follow-up of randomized non-inferiority. Okay, so 2019, they looked at the effects of intermittent compared to CER on glycemic control of patients with type 2 diabetes. So this is a little bit bigger, 137, randomized to one of those two for those 12 months intervention period. They had, intermittent group was 70. They had the 500, 600 calorie for the non-consecutive days. And the 5 days, they had the regular diet, and then continuous group was around 1,200, 1,500 calories a day every day for 7 weeks for those 12 months. And then that was the 12-month intervention, and then follow-up at 24 months. Okay, so for this one, major findings, there is no significant difference in the weight change when comparing the two different groups, and no significant differences between body composition, the fasting glucose levels, lipid, or medication effect score at those 24 months. So kind of same thing on this one. So it's highlighted that like the cholesterol, you can see the continuous versus intermittent, non-significant differences. Also for the HDL, LDL, triglycerides, and weight. I did note, it's kind of interesting thing for the total fat-free mass, the intermittent group did have a lot more. It's kind of interesting how they put this chart together. But basically, after the 24 months, the intermittent group was more likely to have lost more fat-free mass than the continuous group, which is in different studies I found, it's sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. But for this one, there was more fat-free mass lost after that long period of time with the intermittent group. Okay, so strengths for this randomized design, it was very long-term. And then also that they mentioned a high percentage of long-term follow-ups and periodic dietary counseling, so that to improve the accuracy of the intake. Limitations, still a relatively small sample size, lacking that statistical significance of power. With these longer term studies, there tends to be a lot of attrition, and so it's not known if the patients or clients are able to maintain the standards and what they're supposed to be doing. And then the lack of control of energy balance, just like with the other one, not being able to track like their physical activity or how much calories they're burning. So that has a notation. So also gave this one a minus for all that. So interpretation, so both those methods produce the same results. Weight maintenance requires adjustments to meet the lowered energy needs. So because sometimes, or for this study, the intermittent fasting group was taking in less calories. So after both participants from both groups lose the weight, their number of calories needed to burn every day to maintain that goes down, and so it requires adjustments. Like as they lose weight and as their weight goes down, then they need less calories every day. So, and then intermittent fasting may be superior to continuous restriction for that weight maintenance, and then either method may be better at lean mass preservation, but larger sample sizes are needed for that. Okay, last one. So effective intermittent versus the continuous on the weight loss, maintenance, and cardiovascular log risk. And so this was a 1-year randomized trial. Okay, so this is 2018. Also looking at the 5-2 method versus continuous restriction on the weight loss and the cardiometabolic risk factors. And so it also with abdominal obesity. So it's a relatively small sample size as well, 112 participants, about half and half men and women, 21 to 70. Also that 30 to 45 BMI, put into one of the two groups. So inclusion criteria was waist circumference and then different metabolic syndrome components such as triglycerides, HDL, blood pressure, and different drugs they looked at. And then exclusion was treatment if they were being currently treated with insulin or incretin analogs, bariatric surgery, and then use of different anti-obesity drugs. And then some also they noted alcohol or drug abuse, which they noted might have contributed to like procedure or difficulty of the procedure studies. Okay, yeah, so a 6-month weight loss phase. So they had 10 visits with dietitians to sort of keep them on track. And then they had a 6-month maintenance phase without any counseling. And so for the intermittent group, they had 400, 600 calories on the 2 non-consecutive days for females and males consecutively. And then for both groups, it was about a 26 to 28% drop from their normal calories. Yeah. Okay, so major findings. So the weight loss was similar among both groups, 8 versus 9 kilograms. And then there were favorable improvements in waist circumference, blood pressure, triglycerides, HDL, with no difference between those groups. And then intermittent restriction participants. One thing with this one, they found out, so the intermittent group had higher hunger scores than those continuous energy restriction participants using a scale that they, a found scale that they made. So yeah, just showing last kind of similar to all the other ones, but looking at cholesterol, no significant differences between the groups, HDL, LDL, no significant difference between the two groups, and then for the triglycerides as well, you can see there are significant differences. Okay, so strengths on this one, generalizability of the results, high retention rates in both groups, and similar proportions of men to women. And then they also mentioned that usually with these long-term studies, there's around a 20% dropout rate, like 6 months or longer, but it was only 5 to 7% in this group, which is, they noticed, which is fairly low, so that was a strength. But limitation, participants were allowed to vary the day of the week once they fasted. This might have affected biochemical readings, but didn't find any differences statistically between those groups. And also sample size and then control for physical activity and energy intake, energy balance as with the other two. Okay, so going over here to the interpretation. So both groups experienced similar reduction in energy intake. Larger hunger cues led to higher weight regain in the intermittent fasting group after the 12-month follow-up, and then weight loss, and then all those cardiometabolic risk factors are similar in groups, but compliance may be harder for the intermittent group individuals due to increased hunger. So also get this one a minus just for all those things. Okay, so future research, kind of just looking at over the three. So all the studies mentioned that there should be more rigorous controls over the energy intake and the physical activity and expenditure to minimize those confounding factors and those influence that they have on the study outcomes, and then larger populations with all three as well. They were all under 100, which is fairly small. So hard to get statistical significance from that and to provide more meaningful and accurate results. Okay, so the overall conclusions, so implications. So intermittent fasting and continuous energy restriction produce similar results in those multiple cardiometabolic risk factors. Based off what I've seen, I would not recommend intermittent fasting over continuous energy restriction for the improvement of those cardiometabolic risk factors. But clients should be aware of all their options. And then, of course, more research is needed, but the intermittent fasting is a valuable alternative tool to those looking for means other than that traditional weight loss, because we know it's good to have options, and some clients actually may be better or suited for the intermittent fasting versus a regular dieting or regular energy restriction. And then following hunger cue and fullness cues with moderate restriction, so like the normal dieting maybe is easier for some, but then intermittent fasting may be a better option for others. Okay, then kind of just wanted to look at a few other studies just to compare. And so just with all the three I found here in overweight and obese adults, the intermittent groups had comparable effects to the continuous energy restriction groups, reporting that weight loss and metabolic improvements in the short term. Also found that insulin values and sensitivity may be affected more by intermittent fasting groups than continuous energy restriction groups, but clinical significance remains unclear. So once again, just more research and study needed for that. And that's all I have. If there are any questions.
I have questions because I wasn't sure. You said that in the intermittent group, on the days where they are eating, that they had excessive calories. Do you mean they just followed their normal diet on those days? Were they actually told to eat more than they would?
It depends on the group. It depends on the study. And the second study, so they're allowed to eat ad libitum, so eat what they wanted to, and usually they noted that on the non-fasting days, they would eat more calories than usual, as sort of as like a overflow from the previous day, because they were so hungry and their body was telling them they need more calories. So it was around their normal calorie amount, but sometimes a little bit over, but around the amount.
A question, but a comment. I just want to thank you for digging into this research, because I used to work in the sports nutrition field, and this and this is all the rage, intermittent fasting. This is the answer to all your problems, restrict this, do that, and it's just so interesting to see that. It sounds like weren't really significant differences between following a balanced diet, restricting your calories, because the biggest thing that stood out for me was on study 3, those hunger scores were higher. And if you're hungry, you're not going to stick to anything. So I just think it's really interesting, because intermittent fasting, though it's been around a while, still really it's the research saying. So this will be really important for dietitians in that field to be aware of, because sometimes we're to find that culture of what this is So I didn't know from your perspective, I know you said, you were doing this inadvertently maybe when you were an athlete, but like, I mean, anything you can speak to of what you have seen or heard, just with maybe friends or other people having those things.
Yeah, I think this is something that, so like mentioning like the hunger, like some people not able to maintain like the intermittent fasting restrictions is like due to the hunger. I think athletes have, because athletes have, are used to having like a strict sort of routine, they're more able to adhere to that. Because I know like, for me personally, I can go like long periods without eating and I don't mind it. But you know, a lot of people will go long periods without eating and then they get a lot of brain fog or a lot of irritability and things like that, and they just need something to snack on. So I think, yeah, certain people are able to maintain like intermittent fasting sort of method. But overall, yeah, what it boils down to is it's not really about the method of the energy restriction. It's more about the amount of calories produced.